World War II is one of the greatest stories ever told. Millions of small personal tales and momentous decisions paired with astounding luck and sheer absurdity have endured to create a tapestry of historical storytelling that is unmatched. This season, we will be diving into some of the weirdest, most thought-provoking, and untold stories from that time. We will look beyond Pearl Harbor and D-Day and find double agents, fake armies, and a civil war. Our gaze will sweep from Finland to Switzerland to Africa and the waters of the Pacific. This is Forgotten and Found, where in this 10-episode season, we will be diving into weird World War II. So without further ado, this is Season 2, Weird World War II, and we hope that you enjoy the ride. Few countries have such a complicated history during World War II as France. After decades of fighting Germany, going all the way back to the Franco-Prussian War in the 19th century, the French are worn out. World War I traumatized the nation. 1.4 million French soldiers died during the Great War, leaving a void in the nation's soul that lingered on the eve of World War II. For 3 generations, France languished under the shadow of Prussian and then German militarism. No matter how many times they took up arms against their neighbor, Germany continued to resurrect itself. They were insatiable. Time and again, Germany made it clear that it wanted nothing less than total French subjugation. It was exhausting. In 1939, the French psyche was still severely damaged. Faced with the prospect of yet another war with Germany, the French were determined to survive, no matter what the cost. Beginning in 1939, Germany rolled through Poland, and then Denmark and Norway, the Netherlands and Luxembourg. The German war machine seemed unstoppable. Then they seized Belgium, a French former ally, before rolling into France itself. The French had spent years and millions of dollars building the feared Maginot Line, a fortified frontier defensive position that was specifically built to slow and stop a German invasion. But instead of throwing themselves against the Maginot Line, Germany sneaks through the Ardennes forest, a piece of ground deemed impassable by most military planners. Seeing hundreds of German tanks come bursting out of the trees traumatized France all over again. In roughly a month, the battle for France was over. Faced with the prospect of yet another long war, France decided to surrender. This decision has been derided by pundits, historians, and regular readers ever since, but to France, it was the best decision to make at the time. France had no appetite to see another million men die. They didn't want to see Paris reduced to rubble. They did not want to fight anymore. It is easy to heap scorn upon the French for this calculation, but it is nearly impossible to recreate the conditions that led to this decision in the first place. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk, the French army had been divided and swept from the field. To many in France, the war was over, and quickly, and that was a blessing. On June 25, 1940, France signed a humiliating armistice with Germany, which left the country bitterly divided. Hitler made sure that the French signed the surrender documents in the same railcar used to sign the equally humiliating Treaty of Versailles following World War I. To Hitler, this was a moment of sweet victory. The terrible wrongs of World War I had finally been righted. This time, Germany had defeated France, and the harsh peace treaty would be forced upon them instead of on Germany. In the wake of the armistice, France split into 3 parts. Northern France, centered on Paris, is occupied by the Germans. Paris becomes a German bar and brothel. In the south, a new collaborativist nation is formed called Vichy France. Vichy France is nominally independent, but in reality is a puppet of the German Reich. And finally, there is Free France. Free France was comprised of France's remaining overseas possessions and was where the exiled government fled under the protection of Charles de Gaulle. Similarly, the French population was split into three parts. French citizens had to decide which side they would take. Would they collaborate with the Germans and try to make the best of a dire situation? Would they try to go about their lives living under the new reality of occupation? Or would they fight? The simple definition of a civil war is a war in which citizens of the same country fight themselves, especially if one side wants to take control of a region or depose the sitting government. We will see this play out within France as the forces of Free France attempted to overthrow the Vichy French government and regain control of the country. Most people don't see France's situation in World War II as a civil war, but I beg to differ. Many of the French people decided to collaborate. Vichy France was filled with officers and politicians who decided that it was better to throw in with the Germans rather than continue to fight war after war, after war after war with Germany. If Germany was determined to be the master of Europe, it was better to join the winning side. Large portions of the military felt the same way. Others decided to try to live their lives and survive within their new reality. These people refused to collaborate, but they also refused to take up arms. They wanted to be left alone and hoped that the war would eventually reach a conclusion, any conclusion. Lastly, the French who wanted to fight either escaped to Free France or joined the resistance movement, which was growing within France itself. Fighting was a dangerous prospect. You were very likely to die in some far-flung battlefield or be snatched by the growing network of secret Nazi police before being tortured and killed. It was along these lines that French society divided itself and kicked off a civil war. Most people don't consider World War II to be a French civil war, but it was. There were now French on both sides of the war. The French soldiers willing to fight for Germany were placed into the Vichy military and became enemies of Great Britain, their former allies, as well as Free France, their own countrymen. The French who refused to give in to German tyranny reorganized into the resistance and Free French military, which placed them directly in the path of their collaborativist countrymen. Lines were quickly drawn. In this aftermath, Vichy France now controls a large portion of France itself, as well as overseas territories in Africa, such as Madagascar, and in places like Lebanon. Much of the French Empire pledged itself to Vichy France to avoid being dragged into yet another war. After the armistice, Vichy France declared itself free and neutral, which should have, in theory, protected it from invasion or attack by the British. Marshal Pétain is placed in charge of Vichy France, and he pledges himself to the German cause. Charles de Gaulle escapes mainland Europe and flees to Britain, where he urges all loyal French citizens to remain in the fight. He boldly proclaimed that France had not lost the war, only the opening battle. He became the face and the leader of Free France and spent years building a new government in London, as well as directing the French forces still loyal to the tricolors and not the traitors ruling in Vichy. It is now time for the regular French citizen to pick sides, and they did, by the thousands and then the millions. The French Civil War was about to begin, and the results saw the French fighting the French across the globe. Civilians turned their neighbors into German police in Paris, while others began to secure weapons and pass information to Allied spies in occupied France. French soldiers fought against the Allies in places like Lebanon and Dakar, and in their minds they were defending their homes and their empire from continued provocations by the British and later the Americans. No other country during the war is as divided as France. While there are opinions and dissidents in every country, no one else took up arms against their countrymen in such large numbers. In Russia, for example, it would have been inconceivable for portions of the country to rise up against the Red Army in favor of the Germans. Similarly, there were no American divisions that switched sides wholesale in favor of supporting the Axis regimes. Only France saw such confusing fractures, and it was confusing, horribly confusing, not just for the French, but to the Allies as well. Can Britain attack Vichy French positions? How far should they go to secure a military advantage? What about the French still loyal to Free France? How would the French see British forces around the globe? Was Vichy France still at war with Britain? Would the French shoot at potential liberators? Did they even see the Allies as liberators, or did they see them as conquerors? These were questions that flew through the military planning rooms across the British Empire as they began to prepare the next phases of the war, which would see bitter fighting between Vichy French collaborators and the British and Free French units desperately trying to liberate them from German domination. The first and perhaps most shocking incident in the aftermath of the French armistice with Germany took place at a place called Mers el Kabir outside of Iran in French Algeria. It was here that the French fleet had fled following the fall of France. The armistice had assured the British and the Italians that the powerful French fleet, which included some of the most advanced fast battleships of the day, would remain neutral and wholly under French control. Britain did not believe these assurances and saw the French fleet as a major security risk. Instead of allowing the French ships to potentially fall into German hands, the British decided to do something drastic. It is here at Mers el Kabir where you can plainly see the confusion about the state of a divided France in full view. Officially, France was now neutral, it was no longer at war with Germany, and therefore no longer participating in the fighting alongside the British. However, Britain was still committed to supporting French freedom and victory. Many French still saw the British as loyal allies, but that all changed in July of 1940 when British bombers dove out of the sky and hit the French fleet without warning. The attack was pure carnage. At the cost of just 2 planes, the British raked the French fleet and sank a battleship, damaged 5 other ships, and wrecked the port. 1,300 French sailors were killed in the attack, and France cried foul, saying that Britain had attacked a neutral nation without provocation. It was here that the future violence between former allies and fellow countrymen is foreshadowed. France would not quietly leave the war despite the armistice. While the battle at Mers el Kabir was an action by the British against the French, this single moment would go on to heavily influence the coming civil war between Vichy France and Free France. It is important to remember Mers el Kabir when looking at the decision of Vichy French soldiers to fight against their Free French brethren in the coming battles. Fighting between Free France and Vichy France kicked off in earnest in Africa, where France maintained a number of colonies. On June 18, 1940, Charles de Gaulle broadcast a worldwide plea to France's overseas territories, imploring them to join the British in their fight against Germany and Italy and reject Vichy France's illegitimate claims to power. France's overseas colonies were bitterly divided. Some had thrown in with Free France from the jump, but many others had sworn allegiance to Vichy France. But Charles de Gaulle saw them all as territories ripe for the taking. He hoped that by presenting a Free French option, many of the territories would switch sides without a fight. But he was wrong. The port of Dakar in French West Africa, which is in Senegal today, was seen as vitally important. Not only was it the best port in West Africa, it housed more of the scattered French fleet, along with gold reserves from the Polish government in exile and a number of French banks. Charles de Gaulle hoped that he could simply persuade the Vichy French forces defending the port to throw in with him and the Allies. The problem was that de Gaulle had arrived alongside a British task force, and no one in France, Vichy or otherwise, was in any mood to deal with the British after the attack on Mers el Kabir. De Gaulle flew in a cadre of officers to negotiate with the Vichy government in Dakar, and they were arrested on the spot and imprisoned. Then, he tried to land Free French forces on the beaches without any British soldiers present as a show of goodwill, but the men were shot off the landing spots by fortified Vichy French guns. The Vichy French in Dakar had no intentions of leaving Germany in favor of Great Britain. The ensuing battle was a failure. The British task force was pushed off by heavy gunfire and submarine support. De Gaulle had failed to persuade fellow Frenchmen to join his cause. It was a massive political blow to Free France and proved that Vichy France had no qualms about firing on their own countrymen. De Gaulle learned a hard lesson. In areas where French collaborators were willing to fight, they were going to fight. There would be no persuading them, and no overtures of friendship and camaraderie were going to win the day. He was going to have to fight with arms rather than words. Paris had fallen in June of 1940, and by August of that same year, all parts of French Equatorial Africa had declared their allegiance to Charles de Gaulle, save for Gabon. Gabon had tried to declare for Free France, but a hostile population, including the local Catholic Church, demanded that they go with Vichy France instead. The governor, Georges Masson, acquiesced to pressure from General Marcel Tautou, and began reinforcing the colony against the advances of Charles de Gaulle, who was now on the continent and looking to invade. Again, with British naval support, de Gaulle took over 1,000 French soldiers, equipped with Hotchkiss tanks and a handful of planes, into Gabon. The goal was the capital of Libreville, where they would depose the Vichy French government and bring Gabon back into the fold. With Gabon in his possession, de Gaulle would now control the entirety of French Equatorial Africa. This was one of the only battles of the war that exclusively featured French fighting on both sides. Other than the British Navy watching from the sea, this battle was entirely French on French. The Free French forces bombed the Libreville airfield and then advanced using their tanks. They faced stiff resistance at the airfield, but victory was de Gaulle's. With the airfield captured and the British prowling offshore, the Vichy government had no way to reinforce itself or communicate with mainland France, so they surrendered. Seeing a triumphant Free French force take the territory was so traumatizing for the former governor, who was now painted as a traitor, that he took his own life in the wake of the defeat. The battle resulted in dozens of deaths, with most of them coming from the Vichy French side. Once again, the Frenchmen found themselves burying their own countrymen after fighting them in the field. The news of Governor Masson's death was tragic, and Charles de Gaulle was disturbed again when he attempted to convince General Marcel Tautou to rejoin Free France and receive a pardon, because the general refused. He chose to remain in captivity for the duration of the war rather than fight for the Allies. This was a bad sign, and one that weighed heavily on de Gaulle's heart. However, in the aftermath, de Gaulle now controlled most of France's Central African territories. The country yet lived, even if the heartbeat was now deep within the jungles of Africa rather than on the streets of Paris. The largest battle that took place between Vichy France and Free France was in Syria. In June of 1941, a year after France's armistice, Free France began pressuring Britain into helping them invade Syria and Lebanon in order to wrestle them from Vichy control. The British were extremely reluctant to open any new fighting at this point of the war. The British were already overstretched after fighting in Iraq, Greece, Crete, and North Africa. In fact, the British were already short on forces for the critical campaigns unfolding in the deserts around Tobruk. But Free France promised that the territories would be lightly defended, and once the British helped walk over the Vichy French around Beirut and Damascus, Free France would take over the administration and military matters in these areas. When Churchill caught wind of these promises, he urged the military to move on Syria in hopes of securing an easy victory that he could sell to the press. Unfortunately, Vichy France had launched a massive propaganda campaign against the British, calling them the natural hereditary enemies of the French people. They reminded France that Syria had been one of their core overseas territories and that the British were only invading because they wanted to seize Lebanon and Syria for themselves, thus giving them control over the entire Levant, just as they had wanted after World War I. This messaging was very successful, and the Vichy defenders perked up and dug in for a fight. When the British arrived along with a number of Free French units, they didn't find a lightly defended territory ready to fall, they found a large territory with an angry populace ready to fight. The stiff resistance in Syria forced Britain to pull forces from around the Mediterranean to support the fight. Luckily, they had managed to catch the majority of the Vichy Air Force sitting on the ground and were able to bomb them into oblivion. The British quickly destroyed 179 Vichy aircraft due to a lack of fighter support and modern anti-air functionality within the territory. Despite that, the campaign turned into a slow, multifaceted affair. British forces advanced into Syria from neighboring Iraq and marched northward out of Palestine. The goal was to secure Beirut in Lebanon and Damascus in Syria, but instead of welcoming the Allies as liberators, the Vichy French fought hard. The campaign resulted in 10 battles, including fights over the two capitals. Over the course of a month, the Allies lost 5,000 men, including 1,300 Free French, 1,500 Australians, and 1,800 British. The cost was steep. Some have even speculated that the losses in Syria prevented the British from succeeding in Operation Battle Axe in North Africa against Erwin Rommel and the Germans. Vichy France lost between 6,000 and 9,000 men in the fighting, plus over 5,000 sailors and soldiers who defected to Free France. Once again, the French were fighting each other and in large numbers. The Vichy defenders believed that the Free French were traitors who were helping the British carve up the French Empire. The Free French believed the Vichy soldiers were traitors in holding territory for Nazi Germany. The last notable victory for Free France came in November of 1942 when they recaptured Reunion Island from Vichy control. A single Free French destroyer landed a company of Marines on the island and deposed the Vichy governor. The battle only included a single exchange of gunfire between the island and the destroyer Leopard, but the firing soon stopped once the defenders failed to spot a single Union Jack flying in the wind. The battle for Reunion Island is notable because it did not involve the British, and that changed the nature of the conflict completely. The Vichy French were prepared once again to fight, but upon seeing that the opposing force only consisted of French soldiers and Marines, they decided against it. This highlights how much the sour history between Britain and France, as well as the attack on Mers el-Kabir, really colored this conflict from top to bottom. Instead of fighting, the Reunion government negotiated a surrender and returned to Free French control. The last battle of our French Civil War fittingly takes place in Paris in the summer of 1944. The city was antsy and on the verge of starvation. Years of deprivation and exploitation had left many of the citizens fed up and itching to fight. It also helped that the Germans were forced to pull the vast majority of their forces away from Paris to counter the onslaught happening in the east at the hands of the Soviet Union. There were only 16,000 Germans in Paris in August of 1944, along with 20,000 Parisian police who had openly participated in the occupation up until this point. But now the tides were beginning to change. With Allied armies racing in from the west after successful D-Day landings, the resistance fighters in Paris, which had swelled to thousands strong, decided now was the time to rise up and liberate Paris for themselves. A call went out through the city, and the police force, once willing collaborators, joined the resistance for one final battle against German occupation. The resistance was led by a man named Colonel Roll. He and his closest confidants had been fighting the good fight and putting their lives on the line for years. Now the city faced an influx of people who were once part of the apathetic group that just wanted to be left alone, desperately trying to join the winning side. Even some former collaborators tried to swap allegiances at the last second. Weapons were distributed throughout the city, roadblocks were set up, and German troops were funneled into carefully chosen ambush sites where they could be picked off by improvised weapons. The fighting was brutal, close quarters, and urban. Parisian snipers took shots from apartment windows as young men hid behind felled trees to toss Molotov cocktails against German armor. But again, the liberation of Paris saw a hefty amount of French violence against the French. Suspected collaborators were rounded up. Many of them were shot after being lined up against city walls. Running gun battles took place between opposing French militias. While the French resistance was the largest force in Paris, there were also Vichy militias and the struggling German occupation forces to contend with. The resistance had hoped that by sparking an uprising in Paris, they would divert Allied armies into the city to help mop up. At first, the Allies wanted to bypass Paris, fearing a battle would destroy the city and slow down the rapid advance into Germany proper. In the end, a single division of American troops and 2 Free French divisions were rerouted to Paris, where Charles de Gaulle, the undisputed leader of Free France, made his triumphant entry. But the violence was not over. The resistance rounded up tens of thousands of fellow Parisians. Some were accused of things as minor as serving the Germans coffee or going out on dates with foreign soldiers. Estimates vary wildly. Some figures put the number of French collaborators killed at the hands of the resistance at 10,000. Others put the number closer to 100,000 in what has been described as a wild purge. This was the bloody final chapter of the years-long Civil War, which had been tearing French society apart since 1940. De Gaulle called for calm, and he forged a new government in cooperation with the resistance and demanded that all unsanctioned violence against the fellow French be stopped. The violence eventually wound down, but the last gasp of brutality had already been breathed. With de Gaulle in charge and many of the overt collaborators in chains or dead, the French Civil War was finally over. There was no longer Free France and Vichy France. Occupied France was no longer occupied. The Civil War had come to an end. France was going to be made whole once more. After over 4 years of infighting, divisions, suspicion, anger, and violence, France was again on the path to unity and stability. And so, when we look back on World War II through the lens of France, we see more than just a nation occupied by a foreign power. We see a country at war with itself. The fight between Free France and Vichy France wasn't just about politics or geography, it was a battle for the soul of the nation. On one side stood those who chose collaboration, and whether out of ideology, fear, or a hope to preserve what they could, fought against those who chose freedom. On the other hand were those who chose resistance, exile, and the dream of a free Republican France. This civil war didn't just divide government offices or military units, it split families, communities, and futures. And while Free France ultimately emerged victorious, the legacy of Vichy France lingered, casting a long shadow over post-war reconciliation and memory. Understanding this internal conflict reminds us that history is rarely clean-cut. Nations can fracture from within, even as they face enemies from without. And in France's case, the battle against Nazi Germany was also a battle to define what it meant to be French. Could France stay France if it occupied by Germany? Did France need the Allies to survive? Did they want the Allies? Was it worth fighting war after war after war to defend French identity, or was France something that transcended the endless conflicts that seemed to follow it? In the end, France re-emerged from World War II whole, but the anger and resentment against Germany and collaborators lingered for years. Charles de Gaulle would go on to lead France for many years, serving in 2 split terms. His unwavering conviction that France should be free and should fight for said freedom remains a powerful symbol in French politics to this day. Without de Gaulle's convictions and patience in an impossible situation, it is hard to say what France would look like now. De Gaulle navigated a complicated civil war and ended up emerging victorious and successful, which is something that is incredibly difficult to do. Next time you read about World War II and Vichy France, remember that many of these battles were a part of a shadow civil war that ripped France apart from the inside and outside. World War II was murder on the French psyche and put many people in unwinnable situations. Some officers found the choice so harrowing and difficult that they killed themselves rather than live with the idea of being considered a traitor to France. But as we saw, determining exactly what France was during this time was nearly an impossible proposition. And that is history, forgotten and now found. Thank you for listening to this first episode of our second season. We hope you enjoyed it. If you learned something, please consider leaving a review and sharing it with your history-loving friends on social media. Join us for the next episode where we will cover the Battle for Madagascar, which included French, British, and Japanese forces engaged in fighting so furious that many said that the French had fought harder over the island of Madagascar than they had for Paris. We hope to see you then. Until next time, be good and God bless.